When setting up AAA authentication, you're going to have to craft what are known as method lists. Now, what is a method list? Well, a method list is defining the various ways that users can be authenticated. So, for example, method number 1 might be via a Radius server. Method 2 might be via a TACACS Plus server. Method 3 might be using the local username and password database. And method 4 might be the line password that has been set up. So there are different methods that you can utilize to be authenticated. And it's up to you to craft these method lists that are going to be utilized to identify how users are going to be authenticated. So for example, if I have this particular command typed in, it's going to be AAA authentication login. We're going to say login default group. We'll say radius, and we'll say local. What does all this mean? Well, AAA authentication is referring to the fact that we're setting up a AAA authentication method list. So not an authorization list or not anything related to accounting. It's strictly authentication. And then login here is referring to our router component or function that we're going to be authenticating. Now, there's many different items or functions that we can authenticate. For example, we can authenticate console login, and this is done with this right here option, login. VTY login, again, accomplished by just simply typing in login. So when we type in login, we're really referring to those remote methods or physical methods that we can use to access our device for management purposes. So the console lines, the VTY lines. However, if you typed in enable instead here, so enable, AAA authentication enable, then you are going to be setting up a method list that will be utilized to authenticate users that are typing in the enable command. So you're in user exec mode, you type in enable to go to privilege exec mode. Well, how are you going to be authenticated? Are you being authenticated by the enable password that you set up, the enable secret password, or are you going to ask a TACACS Plus server if the credentials are correct that have been provided? You also have the ability to set it up for PPP authentication purposes, as well as 802.1x. 802.1x. So a lot of different options for authentication. After you specify the what to authenticate, then you're going to have to identify the method list itself. So you can have a default method list, and the default method list simply applies to all the components that fall within this particular component or function. If you don't want it to apply to every single component, then you can create your own user-defined method lists. So list 1, list 2, list 3, whatever you want to name it, you can name it. So you could create it once and then you can use it multiple times. And then after that, you start identifying the various methods that are going to be utilized for authentication purposes. So when you type in group, what are you referring to? Well, a group of servers, a group of Radius servers, or a group of TACACS Plus servers. So for example, this would be method number 1 right here. Method number 1. And then method number 2 would be local. So use the local username and password database. So why specify multiple methods? Well, in this case, method number 1 is going to be utilized. And that is Radius servers that I have listed right here. So whatever Radius servers are in that particular group are going to be utilized. That's method 1. Now, what happens if the user types in their username and password when they are asked during the authentication process and they are correct? Then they successfully authenticate. What if they were incorrect? Meaning they either typed in the wrong username or they typed in the wrong password. What happens at that point in time? Well, the Radius server's contact and the Radius server says, nope, incorrect. So the user is denied. Does that mean the user gets to use method number 2? No. No, not at all. See, method number 1 is available. The Radius servers are available. Therefore, method number 1 is the only option you have right now. However, method number 2 is a fallback method. It's a fallback method because if method number 1 is not available, meaning the Radius servers do not respond to the router's request for authentication of the client, then method number 2 kicks in, and the router will use that. So in this case, method number 2 is the local username and password database. So the router will check its local username and password database to see if the username and password are correct. And if they're not correct, then their user is denied authentication. So keep that in mind. The additional methods are only going to be utilized if the method previous to it is not available. So if you had radius servers, TACACS plus servers, local, and then line specified, well, the only way you're ever going to get to line is if the local username and password database doesn't exist, the TACACS plus servers are not available, and the radius servers are not available. So this is the how to authenticate, and you have various fallback options. So your primary authentication method should be method number 1 in your method list.